The morning my daughter-in-law called, she didn't ask how I slept. She didn't ask whether my shoulder was still bothering me or whether I'd remembered my doctor's appointment. She asked one thing. "So Martin, did you try the coffee?" I looked across my kitchen at the little packet she'd taken from the box the night before and placed beside my coffee maker. "No," I said. "I gave the box to your father. He loves Vietnamese coffee. Silence. Not the awkward kind. The kind that makes a man stop breathing because something in the room has changed." Then Lauren screamed, "You gave it to my dad?" I pulled the phone away from my ear. A second later, my son Jason came on the line. "Dad, don't start making this into something." I hadn't accused anyone of anything. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was Lauren demanding to know whether her father had opened the box. The third was the packet still sitting on my counter. 18 months earlier, I had buried my wife of nearly 42 years. Since then, Jason and Lauren had helped with my appointments, my rental property, even the small things I sometimes forgot. I had thanked them for it, trusted them for it. What I didn't know was that some of those forgotten things had never been forgotten at all. And that box of coffee was only the first mistake they made. By the time I understood why Lauren wanted me to drink it that particular morning, I would discover how far my own son had gone to make me doubt myself. And when they finally realized I had stopped doubting, it was already too late. My name is Martin Hayes. I was 69 years old, a widower of 18 months, and retired after 37 years as an environmental health inspector for Wake County, North Carolina. For most of my working life, I had made a living noticing small things other people overlooked, but after my wife Joan died, I had gotten into the habit of assuming that if something felt wrong, grief was probably to blame. Lauren came by on Sunday a little after 5. My daughter-in-law rarely visited me alone. Usually Jason drove, Lauren sat beside him, and the two of them arrived with some reason for being there. A loose gutter, a tenant question, a form they thought I should look at. Since Joan's death, they had made themselves useful in ways I had been grateful for. That evening, Lauren stood on my front porch holding a cream-colored gift bag. "I saw something and thought of you," she said. That alone surprised me. There was no birthday coming. No Father's Day. No holiday. "Well, come in," I said. "Don't stand out there." She followed me into the kitchen and pulled out a rectangular box decorated with a photograph of dark coffee dripping through a little metal filter into a glass. "Vietnamese coffee," she said. "The real kind." I turned the box over in my hands. "You know, I buy the same medium roast I've been drinking since Clinton was president." Lauren laughed. "That is exactly why you need to try something different." She opened the top before I could stop her and pulled out one individual packet. Then she set the box near the fruit bowl and placed the packet by my coffee maker. "Start with this one tomorrow morning." Something about the way she said it made me glance at her. Not suspiciously. Not then. It just sounded oddly specific. "Tomorrow morning? You have that appointment, don't you?" I nodded. "Annual checkup." "Exactly. Try something better than that diner coffee you usually make." She smiled, reached across the counter, and straightened the packet so the label faced forward. That small gesture reminded me of Joan. Joan used to straighten everything. Salt shakers in restaurants, picture frames in other people's homes, the stack of mail beside our phone. She said crooked things made her itch. For half a second, I could almost hear her telling Lauren to leave my kitchen alone. Instead, I smiled. "Thank you." Lauren seemed relieved by that. She stayed another 10 minutes, mostly talking about Jason's work. Their remodeling company had been busy. Too busy, according to her. Jason was taking calls at dinner. Contractors were difficult. Customers wanted champagne kitchens on beer budgets. I listened because that was what fathers did. When Lauren left, she kissed my cheek and reminded me once more about the coffee. "Tomorrow morning," she said from the doorway. "I heard you the first time, just making sure." She smiled again and walked to her car. About 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Robert Carver stood outside holding my aluminum extension ladder. Lauren's father was a year younger than me, broad through the shoulders even in retirement, with the permanently rough hands of a man who had spent 40 years doing electrical work. "Figured I'd return this before you reported it stolen," he said. "You've only had it 6 weeks. 5. 6. He laughed and carried it around the side of the house. I offered him coffee, but he said he was trying to sleep before midnight these days. Then he noticed the box Lauren had left on my counter. "Well, I'll be damned." "What?" He picked it up. "Vietnamese coffee. You know it?" "Know it? I love it. He started telling me about a little place near Raleigh where he'd first tried it years ago. Strong, sweet, almost like dessert. I looked at the box, then at him. You want it? Robert frowned. Lauren bought this for you, and I'm giving it to someone who'll appreciate it. You haven't even tried it. I've reached 69 without becoming adventurous. Why spoil a perfect record? He laughed. I handed him the box. What neither of us noticed was the single packet still sitting beside my coffee maker. Robert tucked the box under his arm and left. I ate leftover pot roast, watched half of a baseball game, and went to bed earlier than usual. At 7:14 the next morning, my phone rang. Lauren. I almost let it go to voicemail. Nobody in my family called me that early, unless something had broken. Morning, I said. So, did you try the coffee? No hello, no question about whether I'd slept. Just the coffee. I sat up against the headboard. No. Robert came by last night. I gave it to him. Nothing. For a moment I thought the call had dropped. Lauren? Her voice came back sharp. You gave it to my dad? I rubbed my forehead. He likes Vietnamese coffee. You gave him the whole box? I believe that's generally how gifts work. Did he open it? The question came too quickly. What? Did Dad open the box? I don't know. Did he drink any? Lauren, what is this? Is he home? I stopped rubbing my forehead. Something had changed. This wasn't annoyance. If she'd been offended because I'd regifted her present, I could have understood that. Joan had once gone 3 days barely speaking to me because I'd given away a sweater her sister bought me. But Lauren didn't sound hurt. She sounded scared. I don't know if Robert's home, I said slowly. Why shouldn't he drink it? I didn't say he shouldn't. You just asked me 3 times if he did. I was just asking. Then I heard movement on her end. A muffled voice. Jason. A few seconds later, my son's voice replaced hers. Dad, what is going on? Nothing's going on. Your wife seems to think something is. Jason sighed. That sigh irritated me more than I expected. It was the sigh people used when they had already decided you were being difficult. Dad, don't start making this into another problem. I stared at the wall across from my bed. I hadn't accused Lauren. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made anything into anything. What other problem? You know what I mean. No, Jason, I don't. Another pause. Then he softened his voice. Just call Robert, okay? Lauren wants the box back. Why? She shouldn't have given it away. She didn't. I did. You know what I mean. Actually, I didn't. And for the first time that morning, I stopped feeling embarrassed about giving away somebody else's gift. I started feeling watched. I'll call him, I said. Jason thanked me too quickly. The moment we hung up, I dialed Robert. He answered on the 4th ring. Martin, did Lauren call you? Silence. Then, yeah. What did she want? Robert didn't answer immediately. In the background, I heard a cabinet door close. She wants the coffee back. Did you drink any? No. The relief that moved through me made no sense, and that bothered me almost as much as Lauren's call. Why not? Because your daughter-in-law called me before 7 this morning and told me not to touch it. I swung my feet onto the floor. Did she say why? No. Then what exactly did she say? Robert was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. She didn't say the coffee was bad, Martin. I waited. She said it was never meant for me. Robert's last sentence stayed with me after the call ended. It was never meant for me. I stood in my bedroom for a few seconds, with the phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet house. Then I went downstairs. The kitchen looked exactly as I had left it the night before. Coffee maker by the wall. Fruit bowl near the sink. Joan's old ceramic sugar jar beside the toaster. And there, next to the coffee maker, was the packet Lauren had taken from the box. I stopped in the doorway. For the first time that morning, I understood what Lauren might have believed when I told her I'd given the coffee to Robert. She had no way of knowing whether I'd handed him only the box or whether I'd put that packet back inside before giving it away. I picked it up by the corners. Old habits, 37 years of inspecting restaurants, cafeterias, processing rooms, and commercial kitchens had taught me one useful thing. When something looked wrong, the worst thing you could do was start tearing it apart before you had decided what you were looking at. People love certainty. Evidence didn't. I turned the packet over under the kitchen light. At first, nothing jumped out. The printing was clean. The colors matched the photograph on the box I'd seen the night before. The packet felt sealed. Then I looked at the top edge. One side was flat and uniform. The other looked slightly uneven, not ripped, not obviously opened, just different enough that I held it closer. I had spent too many years looking at factory seals, damaged food containers, resealed packages, and things employees swore had come that way, to ignore a small inconsistency. Still, I wasn't going to turn one crooked edge into an accusation. I set the packet down. Then I took a clean sandwich bag from a drawer, slipped the packet inside, and wrote the date and time on a piece of masking tape. Monday, 7:38 in the morning. Below that, I wrote the sequence as plainly as I could. Lauren brought box Sunday evening. Lauren removed one packet and placed it beside coffee maker. I gave remaining box to Robert. Lauren called Monday morning asking whether I drank coffee. Robert says Lauren told him not to drink from box. It looked almost foolish sitting there on my counter. 5 lines, 5 ordinary facts, but writing them down settled something in me. Facts had weight. Feelings moved around. My phone buzzed. A text from Lauren. Did Dad give you anything from the box? I read it twice. Not, did he drink it? Not, did he like it? Did he give you anything? My thumb hovered over the screen. Normally I would have answered, probably with a joke. Maybe something about her father's habit of returning borrowed tools 6 weeks late. Instead, I took a screenshot and saved it. Then I put the phone face down. Joan would have noticed the change in me immediately. She used to say I answered family messages too quickly, especially when Jason wanted something. According to her, giving yourself 5 minutes before saying yes could save you 5 years of regret. I still had the paper calendar she used to keep beside the kitchen phone. It hung on the wall near the pantry now, mostly because I had never found a reason to take it down. Joan trusted paper. Phones change, she'd say. Ink doesn't wake up and decide you had lunch on Thursday instead of Tuesday. I used to tease her about it. After she died, I started using the calendar myself. I flipped to the current week. Monday morning had one note in my handwriting. Annual physical. 11 a.m. Nothing about memory. Nothing about cognition. Nothing about Jason or Lauren attending. I reached for my phone again and opened the appointment reminder. My stomach tightened. The appointment time was the same. The reason for visit was not memory concerns and cognitive screening. I read the words once, then again. For a strange second, I wondered whether I had made the change myself and forgotten. That thought came too easily. That bothered me more than the reminder. I called the clinic. After a short hold, a receptionist named Denise answered. I gave my name and date of birth, then asked why my regular physical had been changed. There was typing on the other end. Your daughter-in-law contacted us, she said. Lauren? Yes. She has limited scheduling and portal access listed on your account. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. During Joan's last months, everything had become appointments, medications, specialists, insurance calls, and waiting rooms. I had given Lauren permission to help with scheduling because I was exhausted and grateful for anyone willing to take one thing off my plate. I had simply never removed it. When did she contact you? About 2 weeks ago. And what did she say? Denise paused. I can tell you what's documented. She reported that family members had noticed increasing forgetfulness and wanted the physician to evaluate memory concerns during your visit. Family members, plural. I looked across the kitchen at the sealed plastic bag beside my coffee maker. The packet looked small enough to disappear in my palm. My appointment was in less than 2 hours, and somebody had already told my doctor that I couldn't trust my own memory. I could have canceled the appointment. For about 30 seconds, standing in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand, that was exactly what I wanted to do. It would have been easy to tell myself the whole thing was ridiculous. Lauren had overstepped. Jason was worrying too much. I was 69, not 99, and I had spent most of my adult life keeping restaurants, school cafeterias, nursing homes, and commercial kitchens from cutting corners. But denial was just another way of letting fear make the decision. So I showered, put on a clean blue shirt, slipped the packet into the small document safe in my study, and drove to the clinic. My doctor, Samuel Whitaker, had known me for almost 15 years. He had also treated Joan through the early part of her illness, which meant I trusted him enough to be embarrassed in front of him. He didn't treat me like a child. That helped. He asked questions. Dates, names, simple recall tasks, a few exercises involving numbers, words, shapes, and attention. Nothing dramatic, nothing like the television version where a doctor suddenly stares across the desk and announces that your life belongs to somebody else now. When we finished, Dr. Whitaker folded his hands. You're performing within the expected range today. I waited for the relief to come. It did, but not as strongly as I expected. Today, I said. He nodded. One screening isn't a guarantee that you'll never forget anything, Martin. Nobody gets that guarantee. That landed harder than reassurance would have. I looked down at my hand. There was a dentist appointment. He waited. About 5 weeks ago. I missed it completely. Do you know why? Yes. Joan's birthday would have been the next day. I had spent that morning going through a drawer in our bedroom because I was looking for a photograph of her wearing a ridiculous red hat she'd bought during a trip to Charleston. I found old receipts, hotel cards, one of Jason's kindergarten drawings, and a grocery list in Joan's handwriting. I never found the photograph. I also never went to the dentist. Nobody had moved the appointment. Nobody had changed the time. Nobody had tricked me. I had forgotten. I don't want to turn every mistake I've made into someone else's fault, I said. Dr. Whitaker leaned back slightly. Good. That one word helped more than anything else, he said. On my way home, I stopped at a drugstore and bought a cheap spiral notebook. At the kitchen table, I opened to the first page and drew a line straight down the middle. At the top of the left side, I wrote, "Things I actually forgot." On the right, "Things that do not make sense." Under the first heading, I wrote, "Dentist appointment." I stared at it for a while. Then, I left it there. If I was going to trust myself again, I couldn't begin by lying to myself. The second appointment was different. 2 weeks earlier, Jason had called me at 11:15 and asked why I wasn't at an appointment with an orthopedic specialist. I had looked at my paper calendar and told him the appointment was at 2. Jason said I had written it down wrong. By the time I arrived, embarrassed and apologetic, the office told me the appointment had been scheduled for 11. I had blamed myself. Now I called the specialist's office. After verifying my information, the receptionist checked the record. Yes, Mr. Hayes. It was originally scheduled for 2. I sat straighter. Originally, it was changed to 11 3 days before the appointment. Do you know who changed it? I can see that the request came through the authorized scheduling access attached to your account. She could not tell me more without checking the account details. She didn't need to. I wrote the appointment under the right-hand column. Then I sat there thinking about my keys. They had disappeared from the hook beside the garage door and turned up 2 days later in the drawer where Joan used to keep candles. The property tax notice that I swore I had placed on my desk had vanished, only to appear underneath a stack of magazines. And one Tuesday morning, my Buick had been parked along the curb. I remembered leaving it in the driveway. Jason told me I'd probably moved it and forgotten. At the time, I had laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't want him to see how much that possibility frightened me. I wrote all 3 incidents on the right side of the page. Then I stopped. Question, not answers. That distinction mattered. By early afternoon, I had called the clinic and removed Lauren's scheduling access. I also changed the password on my patient portal. After that, I called the company that handled my home security system. The young man on the phone asked whether I wanted to notify the other authorized users. No, I said, just change the code. He gave me instructions, and 10 minutes later the old number no longer opened my front door. I didn't call Jason. I didn't call Lauren. For once, I didn't explain myself before doing something that affected my own life. At 6 that evening, the keypad near my front door beeped once, then again, then a third time. Wrong code. I was already standing when my phone rang. Jason, I answered. He didn't say hello. Dad, he said, irritated. Why did you lock your own son out? Jason was still standing outside when I opened the door. Lauren stood one step behind him with her arms folded across her coat, her face arranged into the careful expression people use when they have already decided they are dealing with someone unreasonable. Jason looked at the keypad, then at me. You changed the code. Yes. Without telling us? It's my house. His mouth tightened. Lauren stepped forward before he could answer. Martin, nobody is saying it isn't. Her voice was soft. Too soft. We're worried about you. That sentence had started appearing more often lately. Not, what happened? Not, why did you change it? Just, we're worried about you. Jason brushed past me into the foyer. Lauren followed. I closed the door. Sit down, I said. Jason didn't. He stayed near the dining room table and took a leather folder from under his arm. That was when I noticed he had come prepared. Lauren looked around my living room as if she were checking for something out of place. You've been changing passwords, she said. I removed some access. That's exactly what I mean. What do you mean? She exchanged a look with Jason. You're shutting people out. I changed the door code. You changed the medical access too. That told me the clinic had already notified her. I walked to the dining table and pulled out a chair. Sit. This time, Jason did. Lauren sat beside him. I stayed across from them. Jason put the folder on the table. Dad, we need to talk realistically. I almost smiled. Realistically was one of those words people used when they wanted their version of events to sound like gravity. All right, you've been forgetting things. Sometimes. You missed appointments. 1. Jason glanced at Lauren. You've misplaced important papers. I've misplaced papers before. You thought somebody moved your car. I looked directly at him. Yes. He shifted slightly. Lauren jumped in. This isn't about one thing, Martin. It's the pattern. There was that word, pattern. I had spent most of my career using it carefully. A pattern required more than repetition. It required proof that the things actually belonged together. What does my changing the door code prove? I asked. Jason leaned back. That you're getting suspicious. Of what? Of us. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Lauren reached toward the folder. We're not here to fight. She opened it and turned it around. Several pages. Legal formatting. Signature lines. My name. Jason's name. I didn't touch them at first. What is this? Jason exhaled through his nose. It's temporary. That wasn't my question. He tapped the first page. The trust. Joan and I had created the revocable family trust years earlier. Nothing exotic. Our house, the duplex, some accounts. Mostly it was there to make things easier later. I was the trustee. Jason was named as successor trustee. Later. Not now. Jason pushed the pages closer. You could step back for a while. I looked at him. Step back from what? Managing everything. Lauren spoke gently. Just until you feel more like yourself. I finally picked up the papers. There it was. A resignation as trustee. A transition to Jason as successor. Nothing in the document said Jason suddenly owned anything. I knew that much. But it would put him in a position to manage trust affairs while I stood on the other side of the table. Who prepared this? Jason frowned. A lawyer. Which lawyer? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Lauren touched his arm. Martin, please. This is exactly what we're talking about. I looked at her. What is? Turning every question into a challenge. I almost laughed. Instead, I flipped another page. How long have you had these? Jason looked annoyed now. We've been discussing options. With whom? With professionals. Without me? His jaw tightened. Dad, somebody has to think ahead. Then Lauren said the thing that told me where this was going. The duplex is becoming too much. I slowly lowered the pages. What about the duplex? You have tenants calling, repairs, insurance, taxes. It's a lot. I've managed it for 23 years. You're not 60 anymore. No, I'm 69. Jason rubbed his forehead. Dad. What? No one is insulting you. Lauren leaned forward. Selling the duplex might simplify things. I stared at her. I had never told either of them I wanted to sell it. Not once. Why are we talking about selling my duplex? We're talking about reducing stress. No. You said selling. Silence. Jason's face changed. Not much. Just enough. Then he did something he knew would reach me. Mom would want this. My hand stopped on the page. Joan. He knew exactly what that name did to me. She'd want you protected, he continued. She wouldn't want you trying to prove something just because you're afraid of needing help. For a moment, the room went quiet around me. I could see Joan at that same table, with tax envelopes spread around her, glasses low on her nose, telling me not to leave everything until April. I missed her so suddenly it hurt, and that was when I almost signed. Not because Jason had convinced me, because grief has a way of making any sentence that begins with the name of the dead sound like permission. I looked down before reaching for the pen. A date sat in the lower corner of the first page. I read it once, then again, 3 days before Sunday. 3 days before Lauren had walked into my kitchen carrying Vietnamese coffee. I closed the folder. Jason watched me. What? I slid it back across the table. Nothing. Dad, not today. His expression hardened. Lauren stopped looking concerned. Whatever they wanted from Monday morning, they had prepared the paperwork before I ever saw that coffee box. The date on those trustee papers changed the way I looked at everything that followed. Until then, I had been dealing with fragments, a strange phone call, a packet on my counter, a medical appointment I had not arranged, and a son who seemed more interested in my access than my explanation. 3 days before the coffee, somebody had already been preparing for me to step aside. The next morning, I called Susan Bell. Susan was an elder law attorney in Raleigh, whom Joan and I had met years earlier when we created our trust. She was in her early 60s, practical, unsentimental, and one of the few lawyers I had ever known who could explain something without making it sound more complicated than it was. I told her I needed an appointment. When she asked whether it was urgent, I said, "I'm not sure yet." She saw me that afternoon. I brought copies of the trust, photographs of the packet, my notes, Lauren's texts, and the date I had seen on the resignation documents. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands over a yellow legal pad. First thing, she said, "Jason, being successor trustee, does not make the trust property his. If you voluntarily resign, he may gain authority to administer trust assets according to the trust. But he doesn't suddenly own your house or duplex." I understand that. Good, because people hear the word trustee and sometimes think it means owner. She studied me for a moment. Second, nothing you've told me proves what happened to that coffee packet. I felt my shoulders tighten. I know. Do you? Her tone was not unkind. Suspicion is not evidence. Fear is not evidence. Your daughter-in-law's reaction matters, but it does not tell us what is inside that packet. I nodded. 37 years of inspection work had taught me the same lesson. I had just needed someone else to say it while my family was involved. Susan helped me arrange for the packet to be submitted through a legitimate laboratory process. Before I released it, I wrote down everything I could verify about where it had been. Lauren had placed it beside my coffee maker Sunday evening. I had not opened it. It had remained in my kitchen until Monday morning, when I put it in a clean bag and later secured it. Robert had never possessed that packet. No one else had handled it after Lauren left. I signed and dated the record. Susan looked over my notes. "This is useful," she said. "But remember, careful handling after you discovered it cannot tell us what happened before it reached your kitchen." That distinction mattered. While we waited, Lauren started texting. At first, she kept the messages casual. She said she hoped I was not upset about the coffee. Then she said the box had been expensive. Later she wrote that if I did not want it, she would like everything returned. The next morning, she asked, "Did you find the packet I left out?" I did not answer. By Wednesday, she tried again. "If Dad gave you anything from the box, please don't throw it away." I saved every message. The laboratory report came several days later. Susan called me into her office instead of discussing it over the phone. She turned the report toward me. "There is an undeclared pharmaceutical compound present," she said. "It has sedating properties." I stared at the page. The language was clinical and dry. That almost made it worse. So I was right. Susan did not let me have that comfort. "You were right that something is present that should not be there. That is all this report proves." I looked up. Lauren left that packet beside my coffee maker. Yes. She told me to drink it the next morning. Yes. And she panicked when she thought her father had it. Yes. What more do I need? Susan leaned back. To prove who put that substance into the packet. More than this. I hated the answer because it was honest. The laboratory could tell us what it found. It could not tell us who had altered the packet, when that happened, or where. I drove home with the report in an envelope on the passenger seat and a knot in my chest. I had wanted certainty. What I had gotten was something uglier, proof that I had reason to be afraid, but not enough proof to simply name the person responsible and be done with it. That afternoon, Dr. Whitaker called. He had reviewed the notes submitted before my appointment and found another line he thought I should know about. The Family Concern section says, "Family plans to discuss financial responsibility after evaluation." I went quiet. Those exact words? Yes. I looked toward the dining table where Jason had placed the trustee papers. Then I understood something that had been sitting in front of me all week. They had never needed Dr. Whitaker to declare me incompetent. In fact, that would have been far harder than what they were trying to do. All they needed was for me to have a bad morning, to feel slow, foggy, frightened. Then a doctor might say he wanted to follow up, and Jason could put those papers in front of me while I was still wondering whether my own mind was slipping away. They didn't need my doctor to take control away from me. They only needed me scared enough to hand it over myself. For the first time since Joan died, I went back through the last 18 months without calling any of it kindness, just because it had arrived wearing a familiar face. At the time, Every small favor from Jason and Lauren had felt like relief. Lauren scheduled appointments when I forgot which office handled what. Jason met repairmen at the duplex when I did not feel like driving across town. They both had spare keys. Lauren helped sort insurance mail. Jason answered tenant calls when I was at the cemetery or sitting in the den pretending I was watching television. None of it had looked like control. It had looked like family. That was the part that hurt. There had been no morning when I woke up and discovered they had taken over my life. I had handed them pieces of it because grief made ordinary tasks feel heavier than they should have. One password, one spare key, one permission form, one favor that became a habit. I spent the next 2 days taking those pieces back. I called the bank and removed Jason as an authorized contact on anything that did not require him. I confirmed with the clinic that Lauren's portal access was gone. I changed passwords with the insurance company, the utility account, and the service company that handled repairs at the duplex. I called the tenants myself and told them that any future instructions about the property had to come directly from me or from someone I named in writing. Nobody argued. Nobody asked whether I was becoming paranoid. That was almost refreshing. By Thursday afternoon, I drove over to the duplex. It was a brick 2-unit property in Cary that Joan and I had bought 23 years earlier, back when Jason was still young enough to complain about spending Saturdays helping me paint railings. The place was not glamorous, but it had stayed occupied, paid its own bills, and given us steady income through good years and bad ones. One of the tenants, a woman named Nancy Foster, was watering 2 potted plants by her front steps when I pulled in. She smiled when she saw me. "You came to check on the gutter?" Eventually. I looked up at the roofline. "Anything else going on?" She hesitated. "Are you still planning to sell?" I turned back to her. "Planning to what?" Her face changed immediately. "Maybe I misunderstood. Who told you that?" "Jason was here a couple of weeks ago. I felt something settle in my chest." "What was he doing?" "Taking pictures, measuring along the side yard. He said he was trying to get ahead of things." "Ahead of what?" "He said there might be a sale once the family situation was settled." "Family situation." I repeated the phrase silently. "Did he say I had agreed to sell?" "Not exactly." Nancy set down the watering can. "He said you were trying to simplify your life and that he would probably be handling things soon." I thanked her and walked around the property. Near the back fence, I could still see faint chalk marks along one stretch of concrete. Maybe they meant nothing. Maybe Jason had been checking drainage or planning repairs. 2 weeks earlier, I would have chosen the harmless explanation without thinking. Now I wrote down what Nancy had said and left it there. A fact, not a verdict. On the drive home, I stopped at the mailbox cluster at the end of my street. My neighbor, Frank Wilkins, was there, sorting through a handful of envelopes. He had lived 3 houses down for nearly 15 years. "Martin," he said, "everything all right?" "Why wouldn't it be?" "Just asking." I almost kept walking. Then I remembered the Buick. "Frank, weird question. Do you remember seeing Jason at my place about a month ago on a Tuesday afternoon?" He scratched his chin. "Your son?" "Yeah, I think so." "Did you see him near my car?" Frank frowned, thinking, "Actually, yes." He backed it out. I stopped breathing for a second. Backed it out, where? To the curb. I figured he needed the driveway for something. "Did he drive away?" "No. Parked it on the street and went back inside." I thanked him and walked home much faster than I had walked to the mailbox. I remembered that morning clearly. I had gone outside and found the Buick at the curb. Jason came by before lunch and asked whether I remembered leaving it there. I told him I did not. He gave me that worried little look and said, "Dad, you've got to start paying attention to this stuff." I had spent the rest of the day wondering whether I should stop driving. In my study, I searched old text messages until I found the exchange. Me. "Did you move my car yesterday?" Jason. "Dad, you parked it there." I read the words 3 times. Then I found my reply. "Sorry. Guess I really am getting forgetful." I leaned back in my chair. The money, the duplex, even the paperwork suddenly felt smaller than that one message. I had apologized to my own son for remembering correctly. My phone rang. "Robert." I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. "Martin," he said when I answered. "Before you decide what Jason was trying to do, you need to know how much money they actually needed." Robert asked if he could come over instead of explaining it on the phone. That alone told me the number mattered. He arrived 20 minutes later carrying a manila folder and looking older than he had the week before. I let him in without offering coffee. Neither of us mentioned the box Lauren had given me. We sat at the dining table. Robert put the folder between us but kept one hand on it. 2 months ago, he said, Lauren asked me for $60,000. I stared at him. For what? She said Jason's company was having a temporary cash flow problem. Temporary. That was the word she used. Robert opened the folder and slid over a printout of several text messages. Lauren had written that a large commercial customer was late paying. Suppliers wanted deposits. Payroll had gotten tight. She said $60,000 would give them breathing room. What did you tell her? No. That surprised me. Robert had always been generous with Lauren. Why? Because when I asked to see the books, she gave me summaries, not statements, not invoices, not anything I could check. He rubbed the side of his face. I spent 40 years wiring buildings. I learned not to trust a panel just because somebody wrote safe on the cover. Despite everything, I almost smiled. So you refused? Yes. He looked down, then I said something I shouldn't have. I waited. I told her, ask Martin. He always bails Jason out. The words landed harder than he probably expected. You told her that? I was irritated. That makes it better? No. I pushed my chair back slightly. You made me sound like an account they hadn't tried yet. I know. Did you tell her I had agreed to anything? No. But you told her where to go when you wouldn't give her money. Robert nodded. There was no excuse in his face. That helped, but not enough. For years, I said, every time Jason got into trouble, somebody called me before he had to feel the full weight of it. Robert looked at me. You did help him a lot. I know exactly what I did. The admission tasted worse because it was true. I had helped with a truck payment during the first year of the business, covered an insurance gap once, loaned him money when a customer refused final payment. Joan used to warn me that rescue became expectation faster than fathers noticed. I had always said Jason was working hard. Maybe he had been. That didn't mean I hadn't taught him something I never intended. Robert pulled another page from the folder. There was something else. I folded my arms. Go ahead. A few weeks after I refused the money, Lauren said Jason would have the duplex eventually. I stared at him. Exactly how did she say it? Robert thought for a second. She said, Jason will have the duplex eventually anyway, so I don't understand why everyone acts like using it now is some terrible thing. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? I thought she was talking like a spoiled daughter. She is your daughter. I know. You knew she needed money. You knew she was talking about my property like it already belonged to them. And you said nothing. Robert's jaw tightened. You're right. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my eyes moved toward the kitchen, toward the place where Lauren had set the coffee packet. Robert had taken the box. He had known about the debt. He had known about the duplex comment. And now, piece by piece, he was admitting things he had kept from me. A thought I didn't like entered my head. What else haven't you told me? His face changed. Martin. No. Answer me. I've told you everything about the money. What about the coffee? I didn't know anything about that. You had the box because you gave it to me, and Lauren called you before she called me back. Robert leaned forward. You think I was involved? I think I don't know what to think anymore. The words came out quieter than I intended. He looked hurt, but he did not get angry. Instead, he opened the folder wider. Then don't take my word for it. Look. He handed me copies of messages Lauren had sent him over the previous 2 months. The numbers were worse than 60,000. A supplier balance, equipment financing, back rent on a small showroom, credit lines, deposits already spent on jobs that had not started. Taken together, the obligations were roughly $138,000. One message said a major payment would come due in less than 2 months. I read everything twice. Then I saw Jason's name. It was a screenshot Lauren had forwarded to Robert during one of their arguments about money. Jason had written, "Stop pushing Dad all at once. He'll come around." I checked the date. It was weeks before Lauren brought me Vietnamese coffee, before the cognitive appointment, before I changed my door code, before I knew any of this existed. I looked up at Robert. He said nothing. He didn't have to. That message was older than the coffee. Lauren hadn't invented the plan. She had only tried to speed it up. The sentence on Robert's printout followed me home. He'll come around. For several days, I kept hearing it in Jason's voice, even though I had only read the words. There was patience in that sentence. Confidence. Not the confidence of a son hoping his father would agree with him, but of a man who believed resistance was temporary. That was when I went back further. Not to the coffee, not to the changed appointment. Back to the first months after Joan died. There were things I had forgotten, real things. I had missed that dentist appointment. I had misplaced my wallet once and found it in the linen closet, of all places. One evening, after barely sleeping for 2 nights, I asked Jason the same question twice about a contractor he was using. He had laughed gently. "Dad, you just asked me that." I remembered feeling embarrassed. Jason had put a hand on my shoulder. "You're tired, that's all." At the time, that kindness had meant more to me than he probably knew. A few weeks later, I forgot to mail an insurance form. Jason noticed it sitting on my desk, drove it over himself, and told me not to worry. Everybody forgets things. That was the version of my son I wanted to hold on to. Maybe that was why I had not noticed when his language changed. At first, he said, "Dad's tired." Then, "Dad's been forgetting things." Later it became, "Dad's having another bad day." And eventually, "Dad doesn't remember." Those sentences did not sound very different when they arrived one at a time. Looking back, they were miles apart. One described a mistake. The other described me. I opened the notebook I had started after the doctor's appointment. On the left side was the heading "Things I Actually Forgot." On the right, "Things that do not make sense." The dentist appointment was still on the left. I drew a box around it. Then I wrote "My fault" beside it. I did not cross it out. I did not move it to the other column. I had forgotten it. That mattered. If I started changing the truth because Jason had used it against me, then I was doing a smaller version of the same thing he had done. The wallet belonged there too. So did the repeated question. But the Buick did not. Jason had moved it. The keys were harder. I could not prove who had shifted them, but Jason had access to my house during the period they disappeared. The appointment time had been changed through authorized access tied to Lauren. One fact did not prove another, but I no longer needed every strange incident to be fake. That was the part I had been missing. Jason did not have to invent a story from nothing. He only needed something real to build on. A grieving widower forgets a dentist appointment. A tired man misplaces his wallet. A father repeats a question. Those things happen. Then someone moves his car. Someone changes an appointment. Someone places his keys where he would never look. And when he objects, they point back to the mistakes that were real. Say, "You've been forgetting things." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that thought. The most effective lie Jason had told me was not that my memory was failing. It was that every mistake belonged to the same story. The next piece came from a phone call I made to Nancy at the duplex. I asked whether Jason had mentioned anyone else when he visited the property. She thought for a moment. "A real estate guy called me once." My grip tightened around the phone. What did he want? He asked about access to the backyard and whether both units were occupied. Did he say who gave him my number? Jason. I thanked her and called the broker. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply asked whether he had discussed my property with my son. After checking his notes, he said yes. Jason had asked for a rough market estimate several weeks earlier. "No listing agreement," the broker said quickly. "Nothing formal." I told him I would need to speak directly with the owner before anything went further. "What did Jason tell you?" The broker hesitated. That family control of the property would likely be clarified soon. There was that language again. Not sold, not transferred. Clarified. Careful words. Words that sounded harmless until you knew what sat behind them. I wrote the date beside the broker's name. It was before the coffee, before Lauren changed the medical visit, before the trustee papers reached my dining table. I looked at the 2 columns in my notebook again. For days, I had been trying to prove that I was not forgetful. That had been the wrong fight. I was 69 years old. I had buried my wife. I forgot things sometimes. What Jason had done was take those ordinary weaknesses and turn them into permission. He did not need a judge to call me incompetent. He did not even need a doctor to say I was declining. He needed enough truth mixed with enough manipulation that I would become frightened of my own judgment. Then I might step aside willingly. I closed the notebook. I had been trying to prove I never forgot anything. Jason had counted on that. The real question was how much he knew about what Lauren planned for Monday morning. Robert had already admitted enough to make me question his judgment. I did not expect him to call me again 2 days later and tell me there was still something he had kept back. His voice sounded different this time. Not guilty exactly. Tired. "Martin, I need to show you something." "What now?" "A voicemail." I closed my eyes. "From Lauren?" "Yes." "When?" "The morning she found out I had the coffee." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "You've had that this whole time?" "Yes." I did not answer. Robert filled the silence. "She asked me not to share it." "That worked out well for her." "I know." "No, Robert. I don't think you do." He let that sit. Then he said, "Can I come over? Bring the phone." He arrived half an hour later. This time there was no folder, just his cell phone in his hand. He placed it on my table but did not press anything. "I kept telling myself she panicked because she'd made some stupid mistake," he said. "What kind of mistake?" "I didn't know, but you knew enough to hide the message." His face tightened. "Yes." I leaned back. "Why?" "Because she's my daughter." I almost laughed. That's not an answer. It was the answer I was using. That stopped me. Robert looked at the phone. "She called me twice that morning. I answered the first time. That's when she told me not to touch the coffee. The second call went to voicemail because I was in the garage. And this is that message." He nodded. "Afterward, she called again and begged me to delete it." "Did you?" "No." "Why not?" "Because by then I was scared too." I looked at him. "Play it." Robert pressed the screen. Lauren's voice filled the kitchen. Fast. Breathless. "Dad, don't open it. Don't drink it. That box was for Martin." I felt my jaw tighten. The message continued. "If he gave it to you, just put it somewhere and don't touch anything. I'll come get it." A pause. Then Lauren's voice dropped. "Jason said we only needed one bad morning. This was supposed to be the easiest way." The message ended. Neither of us moved. I stared at the phone as if the words might change if I waited long enough. They did not. Robert reached for the device, then stopped before touching it. "I should have given you that the first day." "Yes, I know. You knew she was afraid I'd given you something that was meant for me. You heard her mention Jason, and you still said nothing." He looked at me. I was trying to believe the least terrible version. That didn't make it less terrible. "No." His answer came quietly. For once, I did not have to argue with him to get there. I asked him to play the message again. He did. This time I listened only for Jason's name. Jason said we only needed one bad morning. The sentence told me something important. It also did not tell me everything. I had spent enough years writing inspection reports to know the danger of claiming 1 inch more than the facts gave you. The voicemail did not prove Jason knew what was inside the packet. It did not prove he had touched it. It did not prove he had asked Lauren to alter anything. What it did prove was that Jason had discussed the need for one specific bad morning before the coffee was ever supposed to reach me. And after everything else I had already found, that was no small thing. "What exactly did Lauren tell you afterward?" I asked. Robert rubbed both hands over his knees. "She said I'd misunderstood. Said she and Jason had only been trying to get you to slow down." "Did she explain one bad morning?" "No." "Did you ask?" "Yes." "What did she say?" "That I was making it sound worse than it was." I looked away. That sounded familiar. Everybody around me seemed very concerned about how things sounded. Far fewer people seemed concerned about what they had actually done. I turned back to Robert. "Do not delete that voicemail." "I won't." "Don't forward it around. Don't edit it. Don't record it onto something else and call that good enough. Keep the original phone exactly as it is." He nodded. "If someone formally asks you what happened, will you tell the truth?" "Yes." "Even if it hurts Lauren?" His eyes dropped for a moment, then came back up. "Yes." I believed him, not because he had suddenly become brave, because he finally looked ashamed of the right thing. After Robert left, I sat alone with my notebook open. On one page I wrote, "Jason knew we needed one bad morning." Below it, "Unknown." What exactly Jason knew about Packet, I underlined the second sentence. It mattered. I was angry enough to imagine the worst. That did not give me permission to call imagination evidence. Still, I was done learning about my son through other people's messages. I called Jason. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, I want to talk." "We're talking now." "Not over the phone." Silence. Then, "About what?" "Come by tomorrow." Alone. Another pause. "Lauren should be there if this is about her." "It isn't only about her." That quieted him. The next afternoon, Jason arrived without Lauren. I did not invite him into the living room. We sat across from each other at the dining table, where he had placed the trustee papers days earlier. He looked tired. I probably did too. For a moment I saw the boy who used to sit there doing algebra while Joan stood over him with a wooden spoon in one hand and dinner on the stove. Then I remembered the Buick at the curb. I folded my hands. "Jason, what did you mean when you said you only needed one bad morning?" He went completely still, and the first thing I noticed was that he didn't ask how I knew. Jason's silence answered the first question before he opened his mouth. He knew exactly what I was talking about. He looked down at the table, then rubbed both hands over his face. "Dad, it wasn't supposed to be like this." I had heard that sentence before in different forms. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't meant that way. You're making it sound worse. What was it supposed to be like? I asked. Jason leaned back. You were supposed to realize you needed help. I needed help finding my car. His eyes closed for half a second. That was enough. You moved it. He said nothing. The Buick. Yes. The word came out quietly. And the keys? Another pause. Yes. I felt something inside me go still. Not surprised. Past surprised. You put them in the candle drawer. I thought if you couldn't find them for a while, you'd understand what we were seeing. What were you seeing? You were forgetting things. I forgot some things. You were getting worse. No. You were making it worse. He looked away. There it was. Not denial. Not anymore. I asked about the appointments. He said Lauren handled most of that. He knew she was changing things and reporting concerns to the clinic, but claimed he did not know every detail. You knew enough. I knew we were trying to get you to step back. From the trust. Yes. The word seemed easier for him than admitting the rest. I kept my voice even. What did Lauren tell you about Monday morning? His shoulders tightened. She said she had something that would help you relax. Relax. And maybe make you a little foggy. I stared at him. You heard that and never asked what she meant? Jason finally looked at me. I didn't want to know. The answer hurt more than if he had lied. He rushed on. I thought it was something mild. I thought you'd be tired, maybe slower than usual, and the doctor would tell you to take things easier. You thought that. Yes, but you never asked. No. I wanted that distinction to save him. For one dangerous second, I wanted to grab onto it with both hands. He had not touched the packet. Maybe he had not known what was in it. Maybe Lauren had gone further than he ever intended. Maybe my son was still mostly the boy I had raised, and only partly the man sitting across from me. Then I heard my own thought for what it was, an excuse I wanted badly enough to manufacture for him. I had spent weeks forcing myself not to rewrite my own mistakes. I was not going to start rewriting his. So you designed the trap, I said, and chose not to ask what your wife put inside it. His face hardened. That's not fair. No? I didn't tell her to drug you. I didn't say you did. That's what you're implying. No, Jason, I'm saying exactly what I know. He went quiet. I asked the question I had been avoiding. Why the duplex? He looked tired now. Because we needed the money. That doesn't explain why you thought my property was available. He rubbed his jaw. It was going to stay in the family anyway. I waited. He realized too late what he had admitted. Dad, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. He leaned forward. Someday, that property would probably come to me. Probably. You only have one child, and you decided that made it yours early. I thought we could use the value now instead of losing the business over a temporary problem. I almost admired how cleanly he said it. Temporary problem. Use the value. Stay in the family. Words that could make theft of choice sound like financial planning. You started spending my death while I was still sitting at the table. Jason flinched. Don't say it like that. How should I say it? He had no answer. After a moment he said, becoming trustee wouldn't have meant I owned anything. I know that. That surprised me only because it was true. So what was the next step? He looked at the table. I would have managed things. Then, once you were calmer, I would have talked to you about selling the duplex, or using part of the proceeds for a family loan, with me signing. Yes. So the trustee resignation was just the first signature. His silence confirmed it. He sought back. There it was in plain language. They did not need to steal the duplex. They needed to put me in a position where I would agree to give them what they wanted. Jason's voice softened. Dad, please. I looked at him. If this goes outside the family, Lauren could be ruined. The company could collapse. Our marriage might not survive it. And what happened to me? I know. No. You know now because it didn't work. His face tightened. We made a mistake. You moved my car and lied until I apologized to you. I said I was sorry. You haven't. That stopped him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jason said, just keep this between us. We can fix it. Fix what? The money. The trust. Everything. And the coffee? His jaw clenched. Lauren made a terrible decision. I stood. So did you. He pushed his chair back. Dad, I'm not promising you anything. You're really going to destroy our lives over this? I looked at my son. No, I'm deciding what happens in mine. He left angry enough to close the front door harder than necessary. An hour later, my phone lit up with a text from him. If you take this outside the family, don't expect to see us again. Jason's text stayed on my phone all night. If you take this outside the family, don't expect to see us again. I read it more times than I wanted to admit. After Joan died, I had learned how quiet a house could become when one person was missing. There were evenings when the refrigerator clicking on sounded like company. Jason was my only child. Whatever else he had become, he was still the person who shared my memories of Joan, Christmas mornings, scraped knees, Little League games, and 40 years of ordinary family life. For one weak moment, I nearly called him. I even picked up the phone. I could have told him I would keep everything private. I could have said we would handle the trust, the money, and Lauren between ourselves. The thought brought relief. That frightened me. Relief was not the same thing as safety. The next morning, I drove to Susan Bell's office. She read Jason's text without comment, then placed my phone back on the desk. "What do you want me to tell you?" she asked. "That I have enough." "For what?" I hated the question. "To prove what happened." Susan leaned back. "You have strong evidence that the packet contained something it should not have contained. You have unusual behavior around the coffee. You have Jason admitting he manipulated your memory and wanted control of the trust. You have Lauren's voicemail referring to one bad morning. But the laboratory cannot tell us who altered that packet." I looked toward the window. "Lauren left it on my counter." "Yes. She told me to use that one." "Yes. She panicked when she thought her father had it." "Yes. And that still isn't enough? It may support a much larger picture. It does not turn a laboratory result into a fingerprint." I knew she was right. That did not make it easier to hear. Later that afternoon, Lauren finally contacted me directly. Her message was longer than the others. She said she had made mistakes, but accused me of creating a story around the coffee because I was angry with her and Jason. She suggested the packet might have been damaged before she bought it. Maybe something happened during shipping. Maybe it had been contaminated somewhere else. Then came the sentence I should have expected. "You've been under a lot of stress since Joan died. I think you're connecting things because you're scared." I stared at those words. Jason called 20 minutes later. I almost did not answer. "Almost. Dad," he said, "you need to stop." "Stop what?" "Turning every problem into proof." "That sounds familiar. You don't know Lauren altered that packet." "No. I know she gave it to me, told me when to use it, panicked when she thought Robert had it, and left a voicemail saying it was meant for me." "That still doesn't prove what you're saying." He was right about one narrow thing, and he knew it. "You're angry," Jason continued. "You're grieving. You've been suspicious of everybody for weeks." I looked at the notebook on my kitchen table. For the first time since this started, doubt came back hard. What if I had crossed a line somewhere? What if I had taken facts that frightened me and built something larger because I needed an answer? I had spent my career warning restaurant owners not to decide the conclusion before finishing the inspection. Now I was doing exactly what I had always told other people not to do. After the call, I went into my study and opened the trust binder. I was not looking for anything specific. I just needed to put my hands on something Joan and I had built together. Near the back, between an old insurance summary and a property schedule, a small yellow note slipped onto the desk. Joan's handwriting. "Don't make permanent decisions just because the children are frightened." I sat there staring at it. Then I remembered. Years earlier, Jason's business had been in trouble for the first time. He wanted Joan and me to guarantee a loan. Jason was scared. I was ready to sign because I thought helping him was what fathers did. Joan stopped me. She had written that note after our argument and tucked it into the binder. We never guaranteed the loan. Jason survived anyway. I ran my thumb over the faded ink. Joan had not written, "Never help your son." She had written, "Don't make permanent decisions just because the children are frightened." That difference mattered now. I did not need perfect certainty to protect myself. I did not have to accuse Lauren of something I could not yet prove. But I also did not have to surrender my trust, my property, or my judgment simply because Jason threatened to disappear. The next morning, I reopened my notebook. I stopped looking for one perfect answer. 37 years of inspection work had taught me something fear had made me forget. When one piece doesn't prove the case, you stop hunting for magic and build the timeline. I started with the simplest rule I had ever trusted. Write down only what you can verify, not what you suspect, not what somebody probably meant, not what anger tells you must be true. Facts first. I cleared the dining table and began laying everything out by date. My paper calendar, clinic records, Jason's texts, Lauren's messages, Robert's screenshots, the laboratory report, notes from the duplex tenant, my own written account of the car and keys. For the first time, I stopped asking why. Why had Jason moved the Buick? Why had Lauren changed the appointment? Why had they wanted the trust? Those questions mattered, but motive could be argued forever. Dates could not. Susan helped me obtain an unopened comparison packet from the same product line through a legitimate source. It was tested separately. That packet came back clean. Susan warned me not to turn that result into something it was not. "It doesn't prove Lauren altered yours," she said. "I know. It only weakens the argument that the compound belongs in the product. That's enough." And it was. I did not need one magical piece of evidence anymore. I needed the pieces to stop contradicting each other. I started at the beginning. Lauren contacted my clinic and reported memory concerns. Then the trustee resignation documents were prepared. Then Jason contacted a broker about the duplex. Then Lauren came to my house with the coffee and chose one packet herself. "Try this one tomorrow morning." The next morning was the cognitive appointment. When Lauren believed Robert had received that packet, she panicked. Later, Jason admitted he had moved my car and keys and deliberately exaggerated things I had genuinely forgotten. I wrote each event on a separate index card and placed them in order. The tables slowly filled. One card bothered me: the appointments. I pulled down Joan's old paper calendar again. The annual physical was there in my handwriting. So was the orthopedic appointment I had supposedly forgotten. 2:00. I called the specialist's office again and asked for the change history. The receptionist confirmed the appointment had been moved electronically to 11 3 days before the visit. My paper calendar showed the original time. That mattered more than I had first understood. Jason had used my paper calendar as a joke more than once. "Dad, nobody writes this stuff on walls anymore." But the ink had done something his phone records could not. It preserved what I had believed before anybody changed anything. I checked another appointment. Same problem. Not every appointment. That was important. Some had stayed exactly as I wrote them. Some had changed later. The pattern was selective. That made it harder to dismiss as confusion. Then I came to the notary. I had almost forgotten Jason mentioning one during our confrontation. I called the office listed in an old email attached to the trust paperwork. I kept the question narrow. Had an appointment been scheduled under my name? The woman checked. Yes, Monday afternoon. The same Monday as the cognitive evaluation. Who scheduled it? Jason Hayes. My hand tightened around the pen. What was the purpose? Trust-related documents. Was anything signed? No, sir. The appointment was canceled. I thanked her. Before hanging up, I asked one more question. You don't determine whether someone is mentally competent, correct? She sounded almost offended. No. We verify identity and witness signatures where appropriate. We don't make medical decisions. Exactly. Jason had not arranged a notary because he expected some doctor to hand him control of my life. He had arranged it because he expected me to sign. That difference made everything clearer. The plan had never required a courtroom. It had never required a guardianship case. It had never even required Dr. Whitaker to say I was impaired. All they needed was momentum. A strange morning, a difficult test, a doctor saying, perhaps, that we should monitor things. Jason and Lauren standing beside me afterward, concerned and calm. Dad, you heard the doctor. Maybe it's time to step back. Then a folder, then a signature, then another conversation about the duplex. I stood over the table and looked at the cards. There was no single moment where the whole thing lived. That had been my mistake. I had been searching for one. Instead, it lived in the sequence. Lauren's report, Jason's planning, the prepared papers, the broker call, the coffee, the appointment, the panic, the admissions, the notary waiting that afternoon. One fact alone could be explained away. Together, they told a story that required too many coincidences. I photographed the completed timeline and sent a copy to Susan. Then I placed the original in the trust binder. That evening, Jason texted, "Can we talk?" A minute later, another message appeared. Lauren wants to come too. For the first time, they could not answer one fact by pointing at another. So Jason and Lauren tried something completely different. Jason and Lauren came the next evening. They arrived together, but for once there was no folder, no paperwork, no carefully prepared argument waiting in Jason's hand. Lauren wore no makeup that I could see. Jason looked like he had not slept much. I let them in and led them to the dining table. The same table, the same chairs. Too many important things had happened there lately. Jason sat first. Lauren stayed standing for a second, looking at me as if she was trying to decide where to begin. Then she sat beside him. Nobody spoke. I waited. That was new for me. Most of my life, silence made me uncomfortable enough to fill it for other people. Not anymore. Jason finally cleared his throat. Dad, we've talked. I assumed so. He nodded. About everything. Lauren looked down at her hands. Jason continued. I moved your car. I did not react. I moved your keys. I let you think you'd done things you hadn't done. I knew Lauren was talking to the clinic about your memory, and I wanted you to step down from the trust. Each admission came slowly. Not because I needed to hear them, because he needed to say them. I was wrong, he said. Lauren took a breath. I was too. I looked at her. Her eyes were already wet. What exactly are you admitting? She swallowed. The coffee. My hands stayed flat on the table. I made a terrible decision. What decision? She looked at Jason, then back at me. I thought if you were tired and foggy that morning, you would finally understand why we were worried. The phrasing was careful, still careful, but it was more than she had admitted before. I should never have done anything to that packet. The room seemed to shrink around us. There it was, not the whole truth, but enough that she was no longer pretending the packet had arrived that way. Jason leaned forward. We're not here to argue anymore. I said nothing. We want to make this right. He started listing things. They would never ask me to resign as trustee again. They would stay away from the duplex. They would repay money they owed me from earlier loans on a schedule we could put in writing. Lauren would go to counseling. Jason said he would too if I wanted. They would return every key, remove themselves from every account, and stop contacting any doctor or service provider on my behalf. Lauren wiped her cheek. We know we crossed lines. That sentence reached me in a way I did not expect, maybe because there was no defense attached to it. Not yet, Jason said. I know I made you question yourself. His voice cracked slightly. I don't know how to fix that. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger when I looked at him. Grief, maybe. The old kind. The kind that remembers who somebody used to be and wonders whether that person is still somewhere inside. Lauren said, we were desperate. I almost interrupted. She raised a hand. I know that doesn't excuse it. I let her continue. We let the business get too far ahead of us. Every month there was another payment, another problem. We started thinking if we could just get through the next few months, everything would settle down. Jason looked at me, and then we started treating your help like it was already ours. That was the closest either of them had come to naming the real thing. Not coffee, not papers, entitlement. For a few minutes, I believed this might be the beginning of something different. Not forgiveness, not yet, but honesty. Then Jason said, there's one thing we're asking. I felt the change before he finished. It was small. His tone softened. His shoulders dropped. The apology was over. The negotiation had begun. What? We keep this in the family. I looked at him. Lauren started crying harder. Jason kept going. We take responsibility. We repay you. We do counseling. We stay away from the trust and the duplex. Whatever boundaries you want. And in return, you don't take it any further. The room went very still. Lauren pressed a tissue beneath one eye. Martin, please. I turned to her. If this becomes public, everything is gone. What is everything? The business. Our reputation. Maybe our marriage. Jason said quickly. We're not asking you to pretend nothing happened. No. We're asking for a chance to fix it privately. I leaned back. There it was again. Different wrapping. Same request. Before, they had tried to make me afraid of my own memory. Now they wanted me afraid of what would happen to them. Before, they told me surrender was for my protection. Now they told me silence was proof of love. Lauren reached across the table but stopped before touching my hand. We're sorry. I looked at her, then at Jason. If you're sorry, why does your apology require my silence? Neither of them answered. Jason looked down. Lauren's tissue stopped moving. I waited. Nothing. That silence told me more than another confession would have. I stood. You both keep saying you want to make things right. Jason looked up. We do. No, you want to decide what right is before I get to choose it. That's not fair. It's exactly what you've been doing. Lauren whispered. We're going to lose everything. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, maybe some of it was never yours to keep. They left without shouting. That almost made it worse. I watched their car pull away and understood something I should have learned much earlier. Regret is what people feel when consequences finally become real. Accountability is what they accept when they stop asking the injured person to protect them from those consequences. That was when I finally understood the difference between regret and accountability. The next lesson came when the bills they wanted me to carry arrived in their own names. The consequences did not arrive all at once. That would have been easier, in a strange way. Real life was slower. There were phone calls, statements, meetings, documents, waiting periods, and weeks when nothing seemed to happen at all. Then one morning an envelope would arrive, or Susan would call, and another piece of the life Jason and Lauren had built around my compliance would fall away. Lauren eventually accepted formal legal responsibility for what she had done with the coffee packet. The agreement did not send her away for years, and I had never wanted some dramatic punishment invented for my satisfaction. But it left a criminal record behind her name, supervised conditions she had to follow, restitution, required counseling, and strict limits on contacting me. For the first time, I made a terrible decision. Was no longer simply a sentence spoken at my dining table. It had consequences attached to it. Jason's consequences were different. That mattered to me. He had admitted moving my car, moving my keys, exaggerating my mistakes, and helping build a plan designed to make me surrender control. But I was not going to claim he had personally done what Lauren had done to the packet when I could not prove that. I had spent too much of my career demanding accuracy from other people to abandon it when accuracy became inconvenient. So I dealt with what I knew. Susan helped me amend the trust. Jason was removed as successor trustee. I named an independent professional fiduciary to step in if I ever truly became unable to manage things myself. His emergency financial authority disappeared. So did every remaining property permission, medical access, service account, tenant contact, and informal arrangement I had once treated as harmless. One afternoon I sat at my desk with a checklist and crossed off the last item. For the first time in 18 months, nobody in my family had access to anything simply because they were family. Then the business started coming apart. Jason and Lauren had counted on money that was never theirs. Without the duplex, without another loan from me, and without Robert stepping in, the expansion they had pushed too far could not support itself. The showroom closed first. A month later, equipment went up for sale. The speculative project they had been talking about, as if it would save everything, was abandoned before construction began. Jason took a salaried project management position with a larger contractor. Lauren stopped handling clients while she dealt with her legal obligations. Nobody became homeless. Nobody starved. They simply lost the version of their lives that had depended on other people absorbing the risk. Jason called me one Saturday morning. "I need to ask you something." I already knew what was coming. "How much?" He was quiet. "Dad, how much?" $35,000. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the old version of me would have immediately asked when he needed it. "What for? If we can settle 2 balances, we can keep some of the equipment and maybe restart smaller." "No." He went silent. "You didn't even think about it." "I've thought about it for years. This isn't like before." "It is exactly like before. We'd pay you back." "You've said that before too." His breathing changed. Then came the anger. "So that's it?" "Yes. You're just going to watch us fail?" "No. I'm going to stop financing the argument that you shouldn't." He hung up. 2 days later, Robert called. Lauren had asked him for money. He told me because he no longer wanted silence to become another kind of permission. "What did you say?" I asked. "No." I smiled despite myself. "How'd she take it?" "She asked if I was choosing you over my own daughter." "And?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "I told her I wasn't choosing you over her. I was choosing to stop saving her from herself." That was the first time I heard real change in him too. Weeks later, Jason came to the house. He did not try the old code. He rang the bell. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. He looked thinner, tired, human. "We sold the last truck," he said. I nodded. "The showroom lease is done." I nodded again. He stared past me into the house. "You're really going to let us lose everything?" There was a time when those words would have cut straight through me. A father is supposed to help. A father protects. A father steps in before the fall. But I finally understood the difference between protecting a child and protecting an adult from the results of his own choices. "No, son," I said. "I'm finally going to let you lose what belongs to you." His face tightened. He did not argue. He simply turned and walked back to his car. I watched him leave without feeling victorious. I felt free. 3 months later, Jason called and said he had something of mine he should have returned a long time ago. Jason chose the cafe. It was halfway between my house and the construction firm where he now worked. One of those quiet places with mismatched wooden tables and people reading newspapers over breakfast sandwiches. I arrived first. For years, Jason had been the kind of man who walked into a room already checking who noticed him. Good shoes, expensive watch, company logo embroidered on everything from his jackets to his truck. The man who came through the cafe door that morning looked different. His clothes were still neat, but simpler. No company logo, no watch I recognized. He carried a canvas work bag instead of the leather briefcase he used to bring to client meetings. He ordered his own coffee before sitting down. That small thing should not have mattered. It did. "How's the new job?" I asked. "Buzzy. You like it?" He considered the question. "I'm learning to." Jason had taken a salaried project management position with a larger contractor after his company folded. He no longer chose every project or set his own schedule. He rented a smaller place with Lauren instead of talking about expansions and showrooms. Months earlier, he would have described all of that as humiliation. Now he simply said, "The paycheck comes every 2 weeks whether I feel important or not." I almost smiled. Then he reached into his pocket. He placed a brass key on the table between us. I recognized it immediately. My old spare house key. For several seconds, neither of us touched it. "I should have given that back when you changed the code," he said. "Yes, I kept it anyway." "I know." Jason looked down at the key. "I kept acting like access was something I was owed. That was not the apology I expected. It was better, not because it erased anything, because it named something real." He folded his hands around his coffee cup. "I moved the car. I said nothing. I moved your keys. I lied when you remembered things correctly, and when you started doubting yourself, I let you." His jaw tightened. "I watched you apologize to me for being right. That one landed. I remembered the text. Sorry. Guess I really am getting forgetful." Jason continued before I could answer. "I told myself I was helping you accept reality." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "The reality was that I needed money." I looked at him. "And control." "Yes." The word came without argument. "I saw the things you really forgot after Mom died, and instead of treating them like things that happened to a man who just lost his wife, I used them." He swallowed. "I knew if you questioned yourself enough, you'd eventually stop questioning me." For the first time, Jason was not telling me how frightened he had been, how desperate the business was, or how Lauren had gone further than he expected. He was talking about what he had done. That mattered too. "I understand it better now," he said. "That doesn't mean I trust you." "I know." "No, Jason. I need you to hear that without assuming it's temporary." He nodded. I picked up the key but kept it in my palm. "You won't have authority over my property again." "Okay." "No loans." "Okay." "No access to accounts." He nodded again. "No conversations about what you might inherit." His eyes flickered, but he said, "Okay. If I ever need help medically, financially, or with the house, I decide who helps me." "I understand." "No showing up with a spare key. No calling a tenant because you think something needs handling. No speaking to doctors for me unless I specifically ask." "I understand." I watched him carefully. Months earlier, every boundary would have produced an argument. But what if there's an emergency? What if you change your mind? What if you need me? This time he did not negotiate. That was the first thing he had done that made me believe the consequences had taught him something the apologies had not. "I'm not promising we go back to how things were," I said. "I don't think we should." That surprised me. Jason looked toward the window. "How things were is part of how we got here." We sat quietly for a moment. Then I told him Sunday lunch was still possible. "Not every Sunday, not automatically. Sometimes." He nodded. "And you can call." "I will." "Not about money." A faint smile appeared. I figured that part out. Lauren was different. She had sent me a handwritten apology through Susan several weeks earlier. It did not ask me to drop anything. It did not ask for access or forgiveness. I had read it twice, then put it in a drawer. I had not answered. Maybe someday I would. Maybe I would not. I was beginning to understand that forgiveness and contact were separate decisions. Jason finished his coffee. When he stood, he did not hug me. I was glad he did not make me decide whether I wanted that. He simply said, "Thanks for meeting me." I closed my fingers around the key. "For the first time in a while, you came here to give me something without asking what you'd get back." He looked at the table. "Yeah." Then he left. 9 months after Lauren handed me that box, I walked into a Vietnamese cafe and ordered the one thing I had avoided ever since. 9 months after Lauren handed me that box, I walked into a small Vietnamese-owned cafe in Raleigh and stood at the counter longer than necessary. A former coworker had recommended the place after I mentioned, almost by accident, that I had never actually tasted Vietnamese coffee. The owner, a woman about my age with silver threaded through her black hair, smiled when I told her that. First time, first proper time. She did not ask why I emphasized the word. I was grateful for that. She set a glass on a small metal tray and placed a stainless steel filter over it. Hot water went in. Then she left it alone. I watched the coffee drip slowly, one dark drop at a time. Months earlier, the sight of a coffee packet on my counter had been enough to tighten my chest. For a while, even passing the coffee aisle at the grocery store brought back Lauren's voice telling me to try one the next morning. Now the memory came and went. It did not own the table. I chose a seat by the window. Robert arrived 10 minutes later. He had started calling me more often after everything happened, though never just to ask what Lauren was doing or whether Jason had contacted me. Sometimes we talked about home repairs, sometimes baseball. Once we spent 20 minutes arguing about whether a certain brand of lawnmower had gotten worse or whether we had simply gotten older and less patient. That was friendship, I had decided, being able to waste time together. Robert sat across from me and nodded toward the metal filter. You finally did it. Apparently, you're going to need a nap afterward. I'm retired. That's not a threat. He laughed. Things with Lauren remained difficult for him. He loved his daughter. He also no longer paid her bills, explained away her decisions, or carried messages between us. I spent years thinking helping meant making sure she never hit the ground, he told me once. Turns out, all I did was teach her somebody would always put a cushion underneath her. I understood that better than I wanted to. My duplex was still mine. More important, it was still mine by choice. I had considered selling it after the worst of everything was over. Susan even told me there was nothing wrong with simplifying my life if that was what I wanted. But that was the point. If I sold, it would be because I chose to sell. If I kept it, it would be because I chose to keep it. For now, the tenants were good, the property produced steady income, and I still liked driving over there once or twice a month to check on things. So I kept it. Not to prove anything to Jason, not as punishment, because I wanted to. My life had become fuller in other ways, too. I started meeting former county co-workers for breakfast every few weeks. One of them introduced me to a senior resource organization that needed volunteers to speak with older adults about practical record-keeping after the death of a spouse. I was careful not to pretend I was a lawyer or financial advisor. Mostly, I talked about ordinary things. Know who has your spare key. Know who can call your doc. Write down what permissions you have given. Do not confuse accepting help with surrendering every decision. Sometimes widows and widowers stayed afterward to talk. I recognized the exhaustion in their faces, the same exhaustion that had made Lauren's help feel like rescue 18 months earlier. Jason came to lunch some Sundays. Not every Sunday. That was healthier for both of us. He arrived when invited, ordered his own meal if we went out, and paid his own check. He had not mentioned the duplex once. He had not asked for money once. Our conversations were still careful in places, but they were real. Trust was returning differently than it had existed before. Slower, with doors. That afternoon, while Robert argued with the owner about whether his coffee should have more condensed milk, I reached into my jacket and pulled out my paper calendar. I had an appointment later with the volunteer coordinator. The date was written in blue ink. Robert noticed. You still carrying that thing? Absolutely. Your phone has a calendar. My paper one has never changed an appointment while I was asleep. He raised both hands. Faire point. I smiled and put it away. Joan would have enjoyed that. I still thought about her every day. Some mornings I still reached toward her side of the bed before remembering. Grief had not disappeared because I won an argument with my son, but loneliness no longer frightened me enough to accept anything just to keep family close. That was different. The owner removed the metal filter and stirred the coffee. She slid the glass toward me. I lifted it. Strong, sweet, deeper than the coffee I had drunk most of my life. Un familiar. I took another sip. Robert watched me. Well? I looked down at the glass. I think I like it. He smiled. So did I. The first box was supposed to make me doubt myself long enough for someone else to take the wheel. This cup was different. I lifted it because I wanted it, and at 69 years old, I finally understood how much that mattered.